My next guest has been described as everything from an old-fashioned man to Huckleberry Finn with hormones. Would you please welcome the #1 international star, Mr. Clint Eastwood.
Hollywood venerates Clint Eastwood as the ultimate icon of invincible masculinity. Yet, behind that gilded halo lies an emotional prison where he has kept the women in his life confined by a suffocating grip of control. With 6 lovers, 8 children kept at arm's length, and a trail of opaque legal settlements, Eastwood emerges not as the hero of the silver screen, but as a master director of real-life one, where his closest kin are merely pawns required to adhere to his script. Why would a man who seems to have everything choose a life of solitude and emotional manipulation? To decode the enigma of Clint Eastwood, we must turn back the clock to a time when even a stable home was a luxury. The fissures in his soul did not begin with cinematic glory. They were forged in the restless, nomadic years of his childhood. The nomadic years. Clint Eastwood was born in 1930 in San Francisco, just as the United States plummeted into the Great Depression. His family never had a permanent address. His father moved constantly along the West Coast, taking odd jobs at gas stations or meatpacking plants just to scrape by. The moving never stopped. Throughout his childhood, Clint changed schools year after year. This perpetual state of flux robbed him of the chance to build lasting friendships. Just as he began to settle into a new environment or grow comfortable with neighbors, the family would pack their bags and vanish. This instability forced Clint to develop a survival mechanism. He stopped trying to make friends. Instead of engaging in extracurriculars or team sports, he opted for isolation. He spent his free time catching snakes in the wild and teaching himself to play jazz on the piano. Music became the only channel of communication that couldn't be stripped away from him during a move. These formative years of transience structured Clint's early psychology. He learned a harsh truth early on: all relationships are temporary, and nothing stays long enough to be fully trusted. Loneliness was no longer an imposed state. It became his safe haven. His detachment from others began here, forming an initial shell before a life-or-death incident a few years later would seal his emotional doors for good. Survivor at the bottom of the ocean. In November 1951, a Douglas A-D bomber took off from Seattle bound for Sacramento. Mid-flight, the communication system failed, the oxygen seals leaked, and the fuel ran dry. The pilot made an emergency crash landing in the Pacific Ocean, 3 miles off the coast of Point Reyes. Clint Eastwood, then 21, was on board. As the fuselage sank into the frigid depths, he kicked open the emergency hatch and drifted into the open ocean. The water was lethal. Rather than waiting for a rescue that might never come, he decided to swim for the shore. His battle against the treacherous currents lasted for hours. Just yards from the beach, a new terror emerged. A dense kelp forest beneath the waves wrapped around his legs. The more he thrashed, the tighter the seaweed constricted, dragging him down. Amidst the darkness and the biting cold, the young man was forced to abandon his survival instincts. He held his breath, kept his body deathly still, and peeled away the kelp ring by ring. That razor-thin margin between life and death forged the cold, calculated composure that would define his persona later. Exhausted, he finally touched the sand. That night, swimming across the ocean changed him. The near-death experience taught him the fragility of uncontrollable situations. His psychological response to the trauma birthed a need for absolute command over every facet of his life. He began building defensive barriers by refusing to be dependent on anyone. This need for control would eventually dictate how he ran his sets and maintained distance in his personal life. To execute this perfectly, he turned to the medium of film, a world where everything happens exactly according to script. The Mask of Silence and the Dirty Harry Empire. Clint's start in Hollywood was fraught with rejection. In the mid-1950s, Universal Pictures signed him to a $75 a week contract, only to drop him months later. Executives noted in their reports that his Adam's apple was too prominent, his gait was stiff, and his habit of speaking through clenched teeth made his lines unintelligible. Rather than enrolling in elocution classes to fix his delivery, he changed his strategy. American audiences were accustomed to leading men who talked too much and constantly explained their motivations. Collaborating with director Sergio Leone, he created The Man with No Name. This character spoke as little as possible, revealing himself only through decisive action. He used silence as a weapon to command intrigue. This strategy reached a fever pitch in 1971 with Dirty Harry. The character of Inspector Callahan, who used extreme violence to dispense justice, immediately sparked a firestorm of criticism. Newspapers decried the film as an advertisement for vigilantism. Protests broke out. The public outcry wasn't the only risk. The villain in Dirty Harry was modeled after the Zodiac Killer, a real-life serial murderer terrorizing San Francisco at the time. The Zodiac was actively sending taunting letters to the police and the press. By starring as an inspector hunting a Zodiac-style killer, Eastwood put himself directly in the crosshairs. He accepted the real-world risk of assassination to deliver the performance. Facing both media backlash and credible threats, Clint Eastwood chose to say nothing. He didn't defend himself, nor did he argue. His silence turned the wave of opposition into organic, free marketing. Audiences flocked to theaters, driving the film to record-breaking revenue. But this success came at a cost. America had typecast him as the unyielding, hard-bitten tough guy. He was forced to maintain this mask in public, a performance that inevitably bled into his private life, leading him to suppress his emotions even further. Locked rooms and buried secrets. Off-camera, Eastwood's personal life operated under a regime of clinical control. His 14-year relationship with actress Sondra Locke ended in 1989, and the way he handled the fallout remains a masterclass in the cold exercise of power. While Locke was away working on a film set, Eastwood had the Lockes changed at their shared Bel Air home and had her belongings hauled off into storage. When she later filed a palimony suit, Eastwood turned to Warner Brothers for help. The studio offered Locke a $1.5 million directing deal as part of a settlement. That contract was less of a financial resolution and more of an invisible prison. For 3 years, Locke slaved away, developing projects. She submitted 30 scripts to the studio. Every single one was rejected with vague excuses. The truth didn't surface until 1996, when court records revealed that Eastwood had been secretly funneling his own money to Warner Brothers to pay for the deal. He had effectively bought 3 years of her life just to ensure she could never work again. Eastwood's propensity for manipulation extended beyond the studio system. He was just as comfortable rewriting the rules of civic life whenever he felt slighted. In 1986, when the Carmel by the Sea City Council denied his permit for an office building, he didn't bother with endless litigation. He ran for mayor. Leveraging his celebrity, he won in a landslide. His first act in office? Firing every member of the Planning Commission who had voted against him. He replaced them with loyalists, pushed the permit through, and 2 years later, with the building complete, he walked away from the mayor's office. It sent a clear message. If the existing rules didn't serve Clint Eastwood, he would simply seize the power to rewrite them. Yet, this ability to bend systems could not be applied to his private life. His need for absolute control rendered intimacy a threat, leaving his family life a landscape of fractures. He has at least 8 children. His eldest, Laurie Murray, born in 1954, was put up for adoption. He was unaware of her existence until she tracked him down 30 years later. His other children grew up in the shadow of his frequent absences. The man who could orchestrate multi-million-dollar productions seemed entirely incapable of maintaining a home. Rather than face the unpredictable complexities of blood relations, he chose to evade them, locking real-world doors to keep himself in a vacuum of his own making. When his children like Scott, Allison, or Kyle wanted to appear in his films, they had to go through the standard audition process. They stood in line, competing against dozens of others. If they landed the role, a draconian on-set rule took effect. He strictly forbade them from calling him Dad while filming. He addressed them only by their first names, just like any other crew member. Every interaction was governed by the cold, transactional nature of an employment contract. The children's attempt to bridge the distance through work only left them in the role of hired help. He drew these lines to ensure that no familial sentiment could ever interfere with his control over the set. Art as a voyeuristic redemption. In the latter half of his career, Eastwood shifted his focus to the director's chair. His films began to pivot toward themes of regret and loss. Unforgiven, 1992, and Million Dollar Baby, 2004, share a recurring motif. Aging men burdened by guilt, disconnected from their families, desperately seeking some form of atonement in their twilight years. He used cinema as a surrogate to process emotions he could not express in reality. His need for on-set control tightened further after the 1975 tragedy during the production of The Eiger Sanction. The accident occurred on the second day of shooting. A rockfall from a Swiss cliffside struck and killed a stuntman, David Knowles. Eastwood was standing only feet away. As Knowles's body was recovered, the set fell into a state of shock, and most of the crew assumed production would be halted. But Clint made a startling decision. Dismissing the trauma of his staff, he demanded everyone return to work the following morning. To him, continuing to shoot was the only way to cope with death-restoring order and refusing to let emotion disrupt the schedule. The incident triggered the haunting memories of his 1951 plane crash. From that moment on, he enforced a unique, permanent code of conduct for his sets. No one was allowed to shout "action" or "cut." All commands were issued in hushed tones. Scenes were almost always wrapped in 1 or 2 takes. This method minimized variables and the risk of the unexpected. Every frame had to adhere to a preordained order. The empty chair and the fear of obsolescence. In August 2012, Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage of the Republican National Convention in front of millions of Americans. At 82 years old, he was no longer just a movie star. He was one of the last living symbols of old Hollywood masculinity. The man who once stared down killers in Dirty Harry and rode through the dust of Western towns like a ghost from another era. But that night, something felt different. Instead of delivering a polished political speech, Eastwood asked for a single empty chair to be placed beside him on stage. Then he began talking to it. For nearly 12 minutes, he carried on an awkward, one-sided conversation with the chair, imagining it as President Barack Obama. At first, parts of the audience laughed nervously. Some applauded. Others looked confused. Even people inside the convention, reportedly, did not know where the speech was going. And then the internet exploded. Within minutes, clips flooded television and social media. Late-night hosts mocked him. Headlines questioned whether Clint Eastwood had embarrassed himself in front of the entire country. Some commentators called it uncomfortable. Others called it surreal. A few openly wondered if age was finally catching up to him. But beneath the jokes and memes was something much sadder. The moment felt like a collision between two different Americas. One was the America Clint Eastwood had spent decades representing. Tough, stoic, individualistic. A country where men solved problems with grit instead of vulnerability. Where heroes did not explain themselves. They endured. The other America was already moving on. Hollywood no longer resembled the industry that had created Clint Eastwood. The gritty westerns that made him famous were long dead. Mid-budget adult dramas were disappearing. Studios no longer chased quiet, character-driven stories. They chased franchises, superheroes, CGI spectacles, and global box office formulas. And Clint knew it. For decades, he had survived while almost every other star from his era faded away. Some retired quietly, others died. Sean Connery disappeared from public life. Gene Hackman walked away from Hollywood entirely. The generation of hard-edged movie stars that once dominated American cinema was vanishing one by one. But Clint Eastwood refused to disappear with them. That is what made the empty chair moment so fascinating. It was not just political theater. It felt like a man fighting against irrelevance in real time. Because Clint Eastwood had spent his entire life controlling the frame. On his movie sets, he was famous for efficiency, authority, and absolute control. Actors obeyed him. Crews moved at his pace. He rarely raised his voice because he never had to. But on that stage, for perhaps one of the first times in decades, Clint seemed exposed, vulnerable, slightly out of sync with the modern world around him. And audiences noticed. To some Americans, the speech was brave and authentic. To others, it felt like watching a legend struggle to understand a country that no longer spoke his language. Yet the strangest part came afterward. Clint never really apologized, never fully explained it, never softened the moment to protect his image. In typical Eastwood fashion, he simply moved on and went back to work. That stubborn refusal to retreat may be the key to understanding him. Because even deep into his 80s and 90s, Clint Eastwood kept directing films at an age when most people had long stopped working. Not necessarily because Hollywood still wanted him, but because he did not seem to know how to exist without creating. Friends and colleagues often described him as restless, always moving, always preparing another project, as if stopping completely meant confronting something he had spent a lifetime outrunning. And that is what makes the image of the empty chair linger all these years later. Not because it was funny, not because it became a meme, but because, for a brief moment, America saw something Clint Eastwood almost never allowed people to see. An aging legend standing alone on stage, trying to hold on to a version of the world that was slowly disappearing in front of him. The final take back at his estate in Carmel by the Sea, deep into his 90s, Clint Eastwood still shows no interest in slowing down. While most men his age have stepped away from work, he continues returning to film sets, directing projects like Juror Number 2 with the same quiet discipline that shaped his entire career. At this point, it is no longer about money, and it is not really about fame. Eastwood became a Hollywood legend decades ago. What the film set gives him now is something more personal: control. On set, the world still obeys his rhythm. Cameras roll when he says so. Actors wait for his direction. The chaos becomes organized. The silence becomes useful. But when the day ends, the lights shut off, the crew goes home, and Clint returns to a much quieter world. A world filled with broken marriages, complicated relationships, and children who often knew him more as a distant figure than a present father. Maybe that is why he never truly retired. Work may be the one place where life still makes sense. Late at night, a soft jazz melody drifts through his home. For a moment, the tough guy image disappears. No Dirty Harry, no Hollywood icon. Just an old man alone at the piano, surrounded by the silence of a life that was legendary, complicated, and impossible to fully repair. The music continues as the screen fades to black.